Hello, welcome to the webinar. Today we're going to be discussing the technical security architecture details, part one. We're going to talk about inventory, workflows, and metadata. Here's the outline of our presentation. As you can see, out of the overall architecture, we've extracted the relevant part. All of the architectural elements are available online, where you go visit them. As you go to all.net, click on protection, and here you see the overarching diagram, and you can click on any of the applicable standards of practice and see the details, drill down into those details for even further details. So fear, uncertainty, and doubt. We see a lot of fear in the security space. Most often it's used to sell security, but one of the interesting things about this particular area is that for inventory and workflows and these sorts of things, metadata, maybe a little bit less so for workflow, you see the fear, uncertainty, and doubt coming from the information protection workers. And that's sort of fascinating. In essence, you have people that say, we know how to do our job, stop with all the paperwork. And I can certainly appreciate it. I don't enjoy all the paperwork myself, although I have become efficient at it for lack of an alternative. One of the things you'll hear is that inventory is just too complicated and time consuming for the value. And clearly there is some limit to the granularity of inventory that you can reasonably keep and expect to get value. But of course, the risk also dictates the utility of that inventory. Another one is it's impossible to detail how I do what I do. This is an argument against workflows being too detailed. And it's sort of reasonable, but on the other hand, well, we'll see. A big misimpression is that metadata is just date and timestamps for files and things like this. And of course, that's not really what metadata is or means. And so we should probably disabuse ourselves of that misimpression right off. And then the next one is I don't need to be compliant with name the standard. And it's true, but being compliant with standards is really not why we do protection, hopefully. What we're trying to do is something else. So basically, for all but the smallest one-person businesses, you really have to document what you do to keep track of it. And you have to keep track of it because you want to gain utility out of it. If you don't keep track of it, you'll forget it at some point and lose whatever its utility is. And in fact, worse than that, it'll become a potential hazard. And of course, if it has no utility, since it has costs and risks associated with it, you probably just want to get rid of it. So as a general rule, if two people are involved, you need to communicate in order to coordinate what you're doing. And at some level, what you do has to be describable, so you should describe it. And it's not really about compliance at all. It's about gaining and retaining the value of the information and the resource. We do have people that forget things. And so it's worthy of note what happens when you forget. Verizon did a study a couple of years ago, one of their annual studies. And one of the things that they noticed is that when, if you look at the losses from attacks, approximately 80% of the losses they detected in that particular year were from or of things that weren't in their inventory. So the problem was that the organizations really didn't know they had it. They didn't remember it. So they forgot to take care of it. And then somebody attacked it. It wasn't defended. There was no response. And eventually they're going to win, right? If you try to attack forever and nobody does anything about it, you'll eventually win, or there's a likelihood you'll win. And that's where most of the losses were coming from. Just not having an inventory and keeping track of what you're doing. So, if you forget what you're doing, it doesn't get done. Nobody else does it. So it never gets done. So one of the things that's useful about workflows is it helps make sure it gets done, or that you decided to stop it and provided a reasonable basis to stop it with. And then, of course, the other thing is these systems are used to track what happens. So if you forget who did what or that it was done, you really can't show transparency, attribution, accountability, custody. And these are some of the protection objectives that organizations have. So you really can't fulfill many of the protection objectives if you're not keeping track of what's going on. And also that leads to a breakdown in the legal utility of records. The ability to show what you did may in fact be as important for legal purposes as having done it. So, I run a business and I use inventory, workflows, and metadata. And I do this for a reason. I don't really want to waste my time or money either. I use inventory so I know what I have and when I'm going to run out of it, and workflows so that my team performs consistently and they can show it and I can show it, and not just internally, but to customers and others. And metadata is important for, in our case, for materials relevant to legal activities. So we use a variety of different methods to do these. You can certainly look at the list. I thought I would show you one of the methods that we use for inventory control. Let's see, that's here it is. This is for process control. This is an example of a sample assessment. So as we work our way through the assessment, you can see there are different areas, different sorts of things that we work on, different areas for the assessment. There's a sales process, a teleconference, feedback, and so forth. So if you go to any given place in it, you'll find a record of what's going on. It says these things are required. Maybe some things are optional, so they're marked as optional instead of required. And you can, say I did it or I didn't do it, and indicate that. And so these are the steps in the process that we have, and this tracks how far you've gone in the steps and what you've done and haven't done. And then we have the ability to generate reports. I'll just toss up a report here, and you can see the sorts of reports we get. The annotation says when I did what, or if it was done, and so forth. And then you get a roll-up that says what percentage of the way you are through what part of the process. Fortunately, this is just a sample because we would hope we would never perform this poorly on an actual assessment, but it allows us to make sure we don't. And so that just gives you a sense of the sorts of things that you can use. It's a very simple system. It's not a complex workflow system. It's inexpensive, but you get people working with much more complex systems as well. So now the question, of course, is how you should do it, how others should do it. And when we help people make these decisions, we apply our standard of practice. So our standard of practice is not a standard. That is, it's not something you follow. It's not like an ISO standard or something like that. It represents a set of reasonable and prudent practices. And to understand reasonable and prudent, you should understand the difference between diligent and negligent. If you're reasonable and prudent, you're doing what a reasonably astute person in your field would do on a normal basis. That means you're being diligent. And if you're not being reasonable and prudent, then in the legal sense, you may be negligent. I just want to emphasize that the things that we do are not the only such practices, and they're not always applicable. So what we identify as things that are reasonable and prudent probably are, and we certainly use evaluations of other people with expertise in the field to help us assess that our standards of practice are reasonable and prudent. But just because we say you might do it this way doesn't mean it's the only way to do it. It's just one way to go about it. And this represents a major difference between just sort of using this as a rote method, like most standards say, just force you to do this or that, and using judgment. And we want to use judgment. Of course, it's open source and reviewed, and I just showed you earlier how you can get to it. And we use the standard of practice internally on projects and for clients to help our experts ask reasonably comprehensive questions and codify the responses and do it consistently in a defined language. We use it to help guide decisions using the predefined bases. But also we identify variances from baselines. So if somebody says, gee, we don't do it that way, we do it this way, we review it and say, gee, that looks pretty reasonable to us. If it's something that's one time for them and they're the only time we ever saw it or are likely to see it, we'll just say that's fine. If it's not, then we'll try to update the standard of practice. So we go through ongoing periodic reviews over time to try and make things better. And we've been doing this for a long time. So hopefully we're getting better and better, but the world changes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about inventory. This is our standard approach to inventory. And what we do is we identify hardware, software, content, people, and uses and linkages as things we should be keeping track of. And we use it for different purposes. And they're listed here in blue. And you can read the details from the slides later. We want to make sure it's up to date, accurate, and granular to the required level using some methodology, a unified database, something in people's heads, what have you. So what we do is characterize our clients and our own systems and environments by forming sentences from these things. Okay, so I'll just sort of show you how that works. Let's go to inventory. So you might start out with an inventory of hardware. So if we're going to do an inventory of our hardware, we'll just toss that stuff out. It's used for, oh sure, for business understanding. We don't use it for modeling, analysis, simulation, or risk management. We use it for organizational purposes. We don't use it. So you just get rid of the things that you don't use it for, and you can characterize what you do and how you do it. So I'll just get that sentence. So you can do that for each of the different things you have inventory for, and you can do it for different segments of your organization. So that's what we track. And then we evaluate it based on our decision criteria. Here's the decision criteria over here for inventory that we use. There's risk. Risk has been defined in our earlier presentations. And depending on the risk processes and methods that you use, you'll have different ways to evaluate this. Generally, we'll talk about high, medium, and low risk, but there are different multi-level assessments and so forth. But as a process, we'll just ask you to divide high, medium, and low risk, and then we'll look at your maturity. And so for an example, it says if you're in a high-risk situation, so for example, if you're protecting, things nuclear from going boom, or chemicals from accidentally deploying on the population, or things like that, and you're at less than the defined maturity level, that's the capability maturity model, sort of organized for information protection and similar things, then we think that it's unsafe, and you need to increase your maturity level or not do things at that risk level. So that's our view, is that you better be at least at the managed level of maturity as an organization if you're going to deal with high risk. In the meanwhile, if you're, for example, at repeatable or defined for a medium risk sort of operation, or then we think that these are the things you should use it for, and these are the properties that you should have, and these are minimums, and here's how you should keep them. And there's no particular commentary there. So by applying the standard of practice, we help make better decisions, we hope, about inventory and what inventory to keep. And of course, lower risk, you want to keep less inventory and pay less for it because it's not worth the value you're likely to get from it. Workflows is another area. We've seen lots and lots of workflow systems, and they have a variety of challenges. So we've devised this notional chart about workflows, again, based on risk levels. You have subsets of the elements that are combined. And so generally the model here is that workflow systems take inputs, process them, and produce outputs. And there are also some cross-cutting properties. So what we're talking about here is, here are the inputs to the workflow system. Here's the processing that it should be doing. Here are the outputs it should provide. And there are cross-cutting issues. And I'll just give you an example. It should support process analysis and improvement, right? So that's something that should be done if you're going to be doing process improvement, right? So now we'll just flip back to the workflows, and you can see, again, the decision process depends on the risk level. So we'll just say, for medium risk, suppose everything you have is medium risk. You come up here and identify, well, we do work completed. We don't use authentication to the appropriate to the risk. So that is the people that are allowed to do this just enter data into the workflow system. They're not particularly identified for the task as being adequate to the risk level. Do we track changes of personnel, processes, and authorities? No, that's not an input to our system. We just have generic things that we use. Whatever it is that you have, that's what you'll identify as what you're doing today. And then in the future state, we'll identify that we think these are reasonable and prudent things that you should do. Metadata. Now, metadata is a sort of interesting thing, because metadata, in the context of most computers, people think of it as the date and timestamps on files and path names and these sorts of things. And that's not what the history of metadata is. The real metadata historically, as it has helped to produce the legal system over time, started in the 1400s with with diplomatics, which was used to validate the legal ownership of property. And it's carried through in legal systems, most of the Western legal systems since then. There's a difference in other legal systems, but all legal systems have some sense of this sort of metadata and the way it works. And so archives and records management organizations typically keep a great deal of metadata, and this allows them to verify various properties about things. And I'll just take you to we'll go to the archives, which is a specialized form of the standard of practice. And you can see, and I have it in small font here, you can see just for the creation of data, there are many different things that you might reasonably keep track of, date and time and who did what and access privileges and verification information and so forth. So there's all sorts of things that are called metadata, and they're used in different situations according to different standards. So most of you probably were unaware that there are even such standards. I'll just increase the font so we can see enough about what's going on. So for example, there's different standards for information being transferred, for information that's created within the environment. Acquisition, preservation, and disposition has different standards. And so we advise that different standards for different sorts of systems be applied. But generally, we follow this combined table. It's called the COP table. That was produced on a global basis by the Inter-Pares Trust out of University of British Columbia. And we're participants in the Inter-Pares Trust. And so they've consolidated all the standards over time and brought them together as one place to look. So with that, we've gotten through today's chunk of information. And of course, I never knew about this is probably one of the things you'll hear some people say. And what else am I missing? That's another good question for next month. So next month, we're going to continue through the technical security architecture. And in particular, we're going to be looking at some of the other elements. I think next month, we're probably going to handle life cycles and context, which is a fairly broad and complicated subject. And then we'll go to the process elements and data state, and then into the different parts of protective mechanisms. With that, I'm going to end the recording, and thank you for listening. And then